Welcome back. I am so excited to have with me today Eva Goulbourne, founder and CEO of Littlefoot Ventures. Eva, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today.
Thanks for having me, Nate. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. We had the privilege of connecting a few weeks ago and have been excited, looking forward to this conversation very much because I think we have a lot of the same passion and complementary backgrounds in food and
Yeah.
agriculture. So, Eva, would you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself and how your consulting firm came to be?
Sure. And yeah, sort of echo too. I don't know if it was the LinkedIn gods who connected you and I, but it's nice that sort of like-minded people sort of naturally find themselves in this space. But yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Eva Goulbourne and CEO and founder of Littlefoot Ventures, which is a food systems and sustainability strategy firm focused on using food systems transformation as the climate solution. So my work always sits at that very explicit sort of intersection between food and climate, which hasn't always been as closely linked in at least like, you know, uh, high level public discourse as much as it is today. And I very much was a accidental entrepreneur in starting Littlefoot. I had Littlefoot's going to be 7 this year. And I started it when I was pregnant with my first child. And I was employee number one of ReFed at the time and was playing many different roles in that organization, which for those listeners who don't know, ReFed is a leading organization focused on actionable insights and data to drive change solutions and investments in food loss and waste. So I had this amazing experience with the ReFed team before ReFed was even ReFed, because we were actually working on an initial roadmap report at that time. And then it was so successful that we created the organization sort of thereafter. So that was amazing to start that entrepreneurial journey again, even accidentally now that I think about it too, on the refed front. But when I became pregnant with my son, who's now 6, there was this immediate visceral reaction that I had to, oh my God, I have to do more and I got to do it fast and nothing can slow me down. And so I just like in this, this maternal enlightening, just totally risked it and was like, I think I'm going to start something. And so the name Littlefoot is the ode to the 2 little feet that I was growing inside of me while I was, building this practice. And the thing that, really is important to me is this legacy that I'm not only leaving behind for now I have 2 children, for my kids, but others, and very much this intention in my client work that I'm doing this for you, I'm doing this for us. And, so it very much, like I said, was accidental because I wasn't thinking about starting a business that now I'm like properly running a business. But back then it was like, gosh, how do I just insert myself in a different, more direct way into this world. And so I went for it. And for me, too, it was very much, I think, a natural culmination of my career in food systems work. I've been in food systems work since I graduated from college. And so I've always had this interest and focus on international development, global food systems, because, I spent almost 5 years at the World Economic Forum, which really provides that sort of like inside the black box of how so many global systems really work and gave me that perspective. But I've always had that thread of food and agriculture and sort of, how we make sure that we can feed people, do it nutritiously and efficiently.
I love that background, Eva. And I think it's so powerful that those pivotal life moments, like, having your first child, can really wake you up to, hey, like, there's not a lot of time to lose. And I have a responsibility for society, certainly, but also for my immediate, like, heirs, so to speak, right? The people who will come
Yeah,
after me.
yeah.
What is it? You mentioned that you've been in food systems work ever since graduating college. What is it that continues to draw you to this intersection of food and climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the things that certainly draw me to food, which I would say is sort of my initial interest and passion, is one, just like everybody else, I'm an eater. Food for me is very emotional. It connects to my history, my background, my culture. Yeah, I'm a family member of a generation of Holocaust survivors, and so for me, that connection to food as our identity feels very strong. And also food as a connector. I actually have been subscribing to Martha Stewart Living magazine since I was like, I think 7 or 8. I remember even getting my first one, and this feeling of keeping the home and keeping spaces that you want to come into as, a friend, a stranger, a family member, whoever it is. And food is very much, as we know, is that indicator of a good host is, it's such a part of connection. So, of course, when I was 8 years old, I wasn't like, I'm going to start a food systems transformation consultancy. But this feeling of, oh, there's this thing that feels good and connects us all, sort of across, so many different experience of being a human. And I think the sort of next ingredient for me that happened next was I was a day student at an international boarding school when I was young as well. And so right before my 12th birthday, and as a day student at an international school, you quickly learn, especially for like a American kid like me who may not typically be exposed to just about every other, country on the planet, being able to like learn the difference between Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, all of these, and of course, for those of Asian descent, it's like, well, duh, of course, like how could you not? But for a kid who's from the middle of nowhere in Massachusetts, that type of exposure to other languages, other cultures was really quite formative for me. So, having friends who, were literally from every part of the world really sort of reminded me that I'm a global citizen. There's something out there. There's a bigger world out there. And so, right before my 13th birthday, when I was 12, because it was an international school, we had very long breaks. And my best friend was going home to Seoul, South Korea. And we all decided, like, hey, I want to come see your family. Like, I want to come explore your world. And my parents, well, my dad was totally like, go for it, of course. My mom was like, what? And thankfully, my dad won out. And, they sent me on a plane. Back then, too, you had to have like a escort with you, somebody,
So
because we were so young. And then it was like off to the races to just observe and understand there is this world so much bigger than what we can see right in front of us. And there's so many things that are different within other cultures. And then yet things like food, so many things that connect us. So that was sort of like the second very formative layer to the Eva cake in terms of, this passion for food and, being a domestic goddess. And then this layer of international exploration. And so from then on, I was always sort of not consciously, but like intuitively on the hunt for this feeling of meaning and connection. And so when I started my first very like full-time role as a research assistant to a nonprofit focused on delivering financial services and financial education for tobacco farmers in Malawi and Kenya, that was really also that moment of being off to the races in terms of actually starting to apply this interest that I had, international development, sort of a nebulous, concept, food and ag. It's like, okay, like, what are you actually doing with that interest? And so in that role, being able to actually go to, these different parts of Kenya and Malawi, where we were doing our work, to yet again really internalize and see how everything works in different environments, and the jarring realization of subsistence farming was again just sort of another formative moment for me. And I would say climate, and I'll sort of end on this for now, is a fairly new piece in that, like, I think it's an indicator that I've been, in this space for quite a while now, that these two worlds of, food and ag and food production, of course, there's many natural connections between them, at a certain level, but not in that public discourse that it is today. So that was, I would say, like the third layer of the cake that's now sort of, created this mindset and perspective that I have.
Yeah, I love that, Eva. Thank you for sharing the those different layers of your personal layer cake. I think that's fantastic, and I think it's also very apropos that a communications professional began at the age of 7 or 8 subscribing to Martha Stewart Living. I think that's tremendous.
Yes, yeah. And actually, and even thinking about it too, I've been subscribing to it for so long that people who even get it today, it's no longer called Martha Stewart Living because of her her run-in with the law. And so like I lasted as a dedicated reader since even the rebrand after her insider trading scandal, which was like what, like 20 years ago. So it was Martha Stewart Living when, in the 90s. And, I think it's got a slightly different name now, but yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, no, hey, I love it. I think that's tremendous. You talked about sort of these pivotal moments regarding agriculture around food and like the things that are different and things that bring us together. And you mentioned that climate is sort of this next act that sort of come in. I want to jump ahead to a question that we planned to discuss anyway, but it seems appropriate here, which is, you mentioned that we're at this really interesting moment in history when food and climate have come together and we're publicly talking about it. So I'm curious for your take on what changed and how do we not screw that up, right? How do we take advantage of that moment?
Yeah. Such a thoughtful question. And I would say for me, the and that's been sort of a really profound observation too of just wanting to make sure that I'm learning and evolving with this space. But for example, when I was at the World Economic Forum, which is now, 10-ish years ago, on the food security team, we were quite separate from colleagues on the water team, on the environment team. And even if you think about sort of, in back in college, environmental services or like an environmental focused, like minor or major, whatever it was, had this, it was sort of implied to be around renewables or, biodiversity and conservation, sort of a different connection to the natural earth that had nothing to do with food. And so again, like even at the forum, having totally, of course, there was like, some strategic overlap in our work at certain moments, but the fact that we were all even different teams to me is an indicator today of like, why? And so I think a lot of it has to do with this evolution from the green revolution of sort of, where our industrialized food system has gone. And then this very sort of formative tipping point, in like 2008, 2009, and this additional momentum from the Sustainable Development Goals and this realization that, that's when world leaders were really starting to focus on, oh, we've got to feed 9.5 billion people by 2050. Okay, well, then of course, production is what we're going to focus on. So it's almost like more fuel to the fire in terms of, okay, we just have to produce more food. And since then, which again, it's like, hello, harvest seasons, like we are working with the natural world and any, like farmers or agronomists who are listening to me right now being like, yeah, duh, like this is, they're completely interlinked. Yet again, back then, it was called like climate smart agriculture was what you would talk about at that intersection. And it was commonly like talking about, precision farming and irrigation and very just specific solutions instead of this more nuanced mindset of, oh, in order to feed several billion people sustainably, we need to sustain the soil. We need to sustain clean water supplies. It again, like sounds sort of obvious now, but those worlds were completely different because the driving factors, the business factors have long been on, large ag and large operations, monocrop, and monoculture, and this increased interest and taste for animal proteins and sort of this like quick overcorrection into overconsumption. And now, since that period of time, looking at the nutritional lens to all of this, where, oh my gosh, like the food that we are eating is killing us, or the food that we are eating is not healing us. And, that sort of co-concurrence of diabetes and hypertension, and even co-concurrence of malnutrition, and sort of this, quantity of calories is only one half of the equation. The quality of our calories and our nutrients are so unbelievably important. So I think the nutritional angle has sort of been a bit of that bridge, while also the very obvious, like, we live in a time. We live in a time extreme volatile weather events. It is completely unavoidable. Doesn't matter where you live. We have all been affected in some way by, flash floods and, extreme water damage in certain parts of the world. I live out in Colorado, my first time dealing with forest fires.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden, and again, I'm saying all of a sudden, of course, this has been sort of like percolating for um for many decades, but that sort of personal connection for people, and that like really internalizing, like, oh yeah, I know, like I gotta recycle, and I, Smokey the Bear tells me not to start forest fires, and like, oh, I really should get that electric car. But now all of a sudden this feeling of, oh, is Miami like gonna actually really be underwater soon? And wow, like even the hurricanes that have hit the southeast of the United States recently too, like that impacts our food system. And, all of these things starting just to become more in the public eye, and sort of personally people being affected. And then also just looking at the science, like we've busted through six, if not seven, of the nine planetary boundaries in terms of this very fragile uh, homeostasis that the planet is intended to keep. We've had all these conversations at the UN level and COP and at Davos of world leaders, sort of heeding the cries of scientists, being like, we're at the point of no return. So for better or for worse, too, like we've had no choice until up until this point. The urgency is there, and we won't be relevant in food work if we're not talking about climate. And where, Eva and Littlefoot comes in is sort of the reverse of that too, of helping people and stakeholders in the climate space understand that's awesome that you're focused on that. And if you're really serious about it, you got to look at food. We have to look at our food system.
Yeah, great. I really appreciate those insights, Eva. And yeah, I think it's really helpful to have that history trajectory. I've been doing the sustainability focused work since, roughly 2017, 2018. And so the additional context you've given me and our audience, I think, is really helpful just to understand where we've been. And as you said, this work has been going on for decades, but now it's become more personal, which I think is a really astute and powerful observation. I want you to talk, maybe for the next couple of questions, just about your client and consulting work, because I think this springboards really nicely off of what you've said. One of the things you're doing right now is you've launched not too long ago your second cohort of climate messaging mastery via Littlefoot Ventures Academy.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about the backstory there and what you're doing. I wonder if that plays into some of the factors you've described that have led so many people to come to you and say, we want help with our climate focused messaging.
Yeah. Again, such a great question. So a lot of my work, especially over the past like 2, 3-ish years, there's sort of like two parts of the house to Littlefoot Ventures. That one part services for-profit entities, and very much, in food business, technology solutions, and then the capital providers that service those industries too. So, very much on the VC and investment side. And then the other half of the business and sort of my operations is focused on supporting nonprofits. And as you know, also better than anybody else, philanthropic funding, grant writing, grant strategy, funding strategy is a core part there. So they sort of may, to some people, feel a bit disparate in terms of being those two parts of the house. But for me, they're all, uh, solution providers in this space, and they just happen to run their business models slightly differently. One philanthropically, one, for profit. And of course, that that shows up and drives motivation slightly differently, but they're approximately in this moment thematically looking for the same thing. And this had very much sort of just been an evolution of my practice where nonprofits, for example, would, come to me for their fundraising strategy, and I would be, sort of like doing the usual, like building out the strategy and our prospecting list and thinking about, like your capacity to do invite only grants, versus, sort of like going for the RFPs, through different portals, and like very much the tactics of like team capacity to actually like hunt for dollars. And then I was looking at these organizations that do such unbelievably incredible work and noticing that like the grants that they were writing or the two pagers that they were sharing, the assets that the tools, the communications tools that they were using to articulate their work was totally underselling themselves. Not only, and also for many of them, they have naturally been focused on, oh, we focus on feeding people, we focus on feeding kids, so there's this, we're very adept and have this large muscle around how we talk to food funders, and we very much understand and are fluent in sort of working that part of the philanthropic ecosystem. And I'm sitting there like, you are also a food loss and waste solution. You are a food waste reduction solution. And therefore, you're a climate solution. And even without that sort of in between, if you're focused on food, you're focused on climate. And all of a sudden, it was like, what? Like, what do you mean? So then I was starting to sort of like pull, like, give me the deck, give me, let me look at this proposal, like sort of taking it and being like, wow, I see so many additional benefits to your work when you feed people nutritious, food, then you are, reducing the amount of on-farm losses in your community, which has, a financial benefit. It has an, environmental benefit. And I can see this whole ecosystem. And naturally, as I think nonprofits or anybody doing business, everyone is so focused on their lane and the solution that they provide that it's difficult to, and they shouldn't have to be, experts on every single possible narrative that their work touches on. But if we're looking for funding and investment, it behooves us to almost have these sort of different dialects in what we're talking about. So that was really formative for me to understand, like, oh, it's not actually obvious to other people or organizations. And again, this was happening on the other side of the business too, with brands, upcycled brands, to sort of give a concrete example of them knowing that they had a delicious product, knowing that they could certainly and wanted to talk about this, upcycled angle, but not quite having all the tools and expertise to be able to sew it all together. So that has been percolating for the last few years, and I was like, wow, how crazy would that be if I just like, taught people this, because I'm doing it in my client work, and especially for nonprofits and startups, they don't have the dollars to invest so robustly in not only, possibly hiring somebody like me, but even we're still so new in this intersection of food and climate. They may not have team members on their team who have a lot of this expertise, or they're simply like on a trajectory and it's difficult to sort of shift momentum. And so why not help them in a different way? So I was like, okay, if I'm focusing on this naturally cash strapped, cash sensitive group, I'll do this academy, as I called it. And I put together these 6 modules, and it was without a doubt one of the most difficult things I've ever done, because, and I feel like I sort of gave intellectual birth from that whole experience, because of course there's many like frameworks around fundraising, and, like I didn't invent fundraising nor narrative strategy. These are not new concepts, but there's also no way to be like classically trained in those things. And of course, again, there's like certifications for, grant makers and all those things, but it didn't, none of those things. Number one, I didn't have experience in those. I just have written grants and been awarded grants and had to like, on Christmas Eve still be doing, the input output table and metrics table for submitting something before the December 31 deadline. And so like I had sort of my own war stories and my own perspective of being in a nonprofit setting, understanding, the sort of brass tacks. And then with this new experience to be like, do you know how amazing you are as an organization? And do you understand that you have so many other nodes of impact that you can speak to? And therefore, ta-da, you can unlock this whole other new pool of funding, not new in the world, but new to you because you've been so adept in this other area. Now we're seeing so many more climate dollars in this space, both, corporate philanthropy, all sorts of different investment types. And that's exciting because the dollars are now sort of where they should be. Yet, if we look at where they're being deployed, it's a little bit of the same old from before of like, e-scooters and alternative, renewable energy and, things that nothing against those types of solutions, but a little bit of that more novel focus on climate solutions in a way that didn't have to do with food, which now is sort of at this moment. So I started the course, now have completed my second cohort, and it's been so soul nourishing and so gratifying to see these amazing people and organizations. Like there's a specific sparkle that they get in the eye when they're sort of like seeing these frameworks that I've put together. Because again, like there's no frameworks established for this very bespoke, quite niche way of doing things. And, it's all up here in my mind of like, oh, well, you put together a framework like this. Why? I don't know, because it's like what I know it to be true, or like isn't that how everybody else looks at it? And so trying to sort of extract out of myself what I do on behalf of clients to actually show people, hey, this is how I do it. This is, some things that you might find valuable. And here's a workbook now around it. And here's like a jazzy little matrix. And here's like some exercises for you to actually practice, passing your impact metrics through the climate lens. And this is how we do it. So really challenging me also to extract that from what feels intuitive to me. And, you really don't know something until you have to teach it to another person. And, so I went for it in the spring and it was hugely successful, and, so much support from organizations who graciously sort of like, took a bet on, I'm not a formal educator, but at least like, okay, yeah, Eva knows what she's doing sort of on the philanthropic side. And, when it comes to climate and food messaging. And so, yeah, so now I had my second cohort complete. And that's really one of the things that I'm looking forward to in 2025 of like, man, I gotta scale this. Like the sparkle that's in people's eye, like that's what's driving me. And it's so relieving for people too. And I really emphasize this in the course, like most of the tools you actually already have. So you have more at your disposal than you feel that you do. Because of course people are like, oh, well, I don't want to get, an expensive platform or hire some fancy consultant. And, like, I don't want to have to like spend a whole bunch of money to make money. And I'm like, yeah, I totally understand that. And here are the ways that we're doing some like internal harvesting of our own assets, our own networks. And, even for example, like, how are you using your board of directors? Well, like they're not really focused on fundraising. It's like, that's okay. I mean, one, you should probably look at that, but that's okay in that like their expertise. But again, we're all eaters. We're all, a lot of board members are on panels, funder salons, like you never know where your people are going to be. So making sure like, do you have a packet of information about your work? In the space that you can provide to board of directors. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah. So it's like we're not doing things revolutionary, in a sort of revolutionary way, but reminding ourselves that we have a lot more assets. And then the other part that I think is valuable for people too is this is not scope creep. This is not mission creep. We're not contorting ourselves into what the funder wants and to show something that we are fundamentally not. It's about showcasing an entire other dimension to the positive impact of our work. And I think that's, the thing that continues to make it really impactful for people, and what I'm excited to sort of continue to pursue next year too, to be able to scale this, because I do think that's how we sort of really create this change that we all want to see.
Yeah, I love that story, Eva, and I'm really excited to hear about the uh, robust outpouring of support that you've received for these first two cohorts, because I see the same thing in my consulting practice. I have clients who are in academia, for example, and I think it's not just about the tremendous opportunity to take action now on climate. The reality is, at least here in the United States, I have, there are large public universities, just to throw out an example, that are doing lots of really important work in climate and mitigating the risk of severe weather, etc. But they can't use those words because of the regulatory environment or the, who's in power in their state legislature or what have you. And so I think, a term my former president of a company where I used to work once said, was translational communication. I think lots of us need to
Ooh,
be
yeah.
more robust and creative and divergent in how we show up and have these conversations and move things forward. Not to say that we should shy away from climate change or other terms like that, because I think we have to be direct and go where the science leads us. But there's so much of a need here, and I think you've tapped into that, which is really exciting for me. Does that resonate?
100%. And I love even that, that term that now that you've said it sounds so obvious, but I've never thought of, it is that translation. I call it sort of like, adding a new dialect to our language, and, you saying that translation. And especially that's a really great example too on the climate side, and in the context that you shared in academia, where the fact that you even need to shift language around is that's a whole other problem. And that's a problem. And the power to be able, and that's like a systemic issue in and of itself, which I don't have enough time on this planet to address that one. But that's sort of a great example too of why it's so important to have these other communication skill sets, where it's also just good business too, in the sense of, yes, of course, we could talk the science all day long, and we do need to keep things data and science based, and that doesn't motivate everybody. That may inform how we work with clients and how we work on projects, and how that sort of shapes how we move in this space. And that means nothing to somebody who is like a fifth generation cattle rancher, in the Midwest, and we're trying to tell, well, these cows are really, causing this methane problem. It's like, yeah, and like you're already off to a rough start with, not meeting somebody where they're at. And also, even if a relevant climate solution ends up being appropriate, there are other additional benefits of said solution that you could be focusing on, where, it's sort of like, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, where, there might be these amazing positive climate impacts and, carbon mitigation strategies accompanying with whatever is going on. And let's focus on the fact that this means more dollars for farmers, a more competitive product, a more, additional revenue streams if we're looking at upcycled. So I think that's one of those components that's really important for people to remember too, where even if we have a value around, science or the facts and keeping things, very much black and white, there's no human mind that is convinced based on, that very binary thinking.
Yeah, it's so true, Eva. Last comment on this, and then we'll move on. But there's a really great book by Morgan Housel called "Same as Ever," and I think one of the first chapters in that book is called "The Best Story Wins," or story. Stories win in general, right? So at the end of the day, to your point, certainly the science and data matter a lot, and what moves the needle is that personalization of the message, right? What does this mean to me? And that's different things for different people. But I think you've articulated that so well. I want to go to funding and fundraising for a moment, because a lot of my clients and audience are really curious, especially at a time when, as you said, nonprofits in particular are strapped for time. They're managing multiple grants, etc. Funding diversification is on the top of a lot of leaders' minds, and you have deep expertise with private foundations, with family offices, etc. I'm curious if you could just maybe teach for a minute on, what are some of those maybe more niche type of funders looking for in this environment, and how can nonprofits position themselves to actually engage them in meaningful projects together?
Yeah, million dollar question. And this is the number one question that people ask too when they take the course, because basically, of course, like that's exactly, that's the soft underbelly that everybody's trying to get to. And one of the things that I share with people that I've observed is one, all of those sort of different philanthropic entities that you just described operate completely differently, because even corporate foundations, and what I call like institutional foundations, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Ford Foundation, like really truly large, monsters of philanthropy, have different personalities versus, family foundations and everything sort of in between, because there's also then the venture philanthropy and social impact sort of part of it, which will be, our podcast episode number 2. But the thing that people may not realize is it feels confusing and sort of nebulous to operate in the family philanthropy space because it was designed that way. That's exactly where it's supposed to be. There's, this opacity to those, sort of very inner circles by design. And not, even implying like for any insidious reasons or anything like that. But the way that food is personal, finances are personal. And when you're dealing with family offices who have, foundations, in most cases, like one, oftentimes there isn't like a whole team on the foundation side of a family office. Sometimes it's even, excuse me, the same person, sort of operating multiple sides of a family business, who will make sure to write the checks to the local food pantry the same time every year, making sure that the philanthropic dollars are getting to that, local hospital for that gala or whatever it might be. So understanding too that, excuse me, there is this nuance even amongst family foundations and family offices, that they're not, and this perception that they're black boxes because they're so complex. It's actually sort of the opposite, where sometimes the trustees just like to write checks when they meet people, and something feels right and something feels good. Some of them, and then especially that generation of baby boomers and older, this I think that is sort of a really fascinating thing for all of us in the nonprofit and philanthropy space to understand, is this huge transfer of generational wealth that's happening right now between, boomers and then on to Gen X and millennials. And we, as the millennial generation, I think I'm a geriatric millennial, give differently and have different life experiences. And philanthropy isn't just like a thing for the rich, a thing that like, other people do. It's very personal, driven by personal experiences. So I think that's sort of a positive indicator for nonprofits in this space in terms of family dollars, in that this new generation understands and prioritizes the world around them in a different way than, their grandparents or mom and dad did to, start the original business that started the philanthropy. And then as part of that, it's also very confusing for people too, where it's like, okay, Eva, thanks for stating the obvious. Like, it's so impossible to get in. Like, how do we get in? Because I also see things like, these foundations not having websites, or having websites that like a landing page.
Yeah.
Yeah, made in like 1975, before the internet even existed. Like a lot of like, how do I even contact these people? And so for that, I would say, one, to understand really back to the motivations and sort of different angles that we as a nonprofit organization satisfy, where an example being, okay, I'm a food rescue organization in the Rocky Mountains. So I can think about, and we want to raise $500,000 for the next year, to, get a new facility for us to be able to process this, fresh fruits and vegetables for our community. you can think about the family foundations who are focused on food security as one angle. You can focus on family foundations that may focus on food loss and waste, and agriculture as another angle, nutrition and sort of food as medicine as another angle for different family foundations, climate as another one, as hopefully people are now convinced. Like that's my party trick, to be able to convince any climate funder that food is the solution. And then also thinking at sort of toggling at a different level, place-based versus national. A lot of foundations, especially family foundations, may focus on place-based work, and some of them are focused on national. So, of course, going first for, using the Rocky Mountain example, who are our high net worth individuals and family foundations in our state as another sort of like node of exploration. And then thinking about at the national level, those family foundations who may have a vested interest in this space and the impact of our solution, even if they're not in, the Rocky Mountains. So I think that's one really important thing for people and nonprofits to like do their homework in advance, which I know sounds like obnoxious, but you need to have your messaging straight so that you can recognize yourself in these family foundations and move forward. I think the other thing for people to understand too is, and I say this all the time, both in the messaging course and even for those that I mentor, we offer and share value before we're ever asked. There's like this temptation to just go right in and be like, yeah, so we're looking at $500,000 fundraise. Here's our impact report and da 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 da. And it's like, okay, bold. That might work for some, and especially for funders who, by design, of course, everybody is sort of angling them for dollars every single time they walk out into the world. And so being able to allow them to sit down and you ask them, what's top of mind for you? What solutions, what's keeping you up at night? What are some solutions that you're really excited by, ones that you want to learn more about? And sort of that good old fashioned stakeholder management of, sending that note being like, you know, so and so foundation, it was so wonderful to spend time with you at X conference. I loved the example that you shared about some work that you're doing in Peru. Saw this article and thought of you, and I thought it was really interesting, on page 4, whatever. Like sharing uh interest and value to where you already know that that person is, again, sounds like really foundational, and people forget to do that. And the truth matter is, for these more opaque entities of philanthropy, they, and this isn't, I can't sort of prove this statistically, but when you have those more strategic relationships, trust-based, funders, you are more likely to get dollars for longer periods of time or get more dollars by virtue of trust has been built. They know you now. You're not just, an RFP application that came in before the deadline that, a program manager is reviewing. But now they can sort of see the additional magic. And, again, your audience may be listening like, oh my God, like who has time to do that? But that this is part of the work, and this is part of I think sort of a different way of doing philanthropy and a different way of doing nonprofit management, because these funders can also have additional value for you beyond the check also. So I'll
Yeah,
pause there, but there's many other little.
wow, I would love to spend another hour on this and many other topics with you, Eva, but I know our time is short. But I really appreciate both the candor about the level of work and creative thinking that's required, and also about the reality of the more trust you build, the more relationships you build, the better you try to add value before you ever start talking about we need X to meet X goal. What a powerful way to start a partner. What it is, it's a strategic partnership, right? And hopefully it's a long-term partnership that benefits both parties.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
Eva, in the few minutes that we have remaining, I think we should do a second episode one of these days. I'd love to take you up on that. But let's close with a couple of final questions. As people look back on your life and contributions, both in the food and climate space and also just more broadly, what do you want people to say about you?
Oh, that's such a good one. When people look back at my legacy and my contributions into this space, um, I hope that they look at that story arc of Eva and they're like, gosh, you know what? She was always speaking her truth. She was always authentic in what she saw, what she said, what she felt, what she did, and operated with a true sense of integrity. And what I mean by that, instead of like, oh gosh, my legacy, well, I hope people think I'm like nice and cool and funny and, like did all sorts of like amazing things in her life. Like, yeah, the ego might want that, but anybody, most people can sort of, have that legacy as we should. But I think what's inspiring, hopefully, to people is I'm just trucking along on this road because I have this feeling and this vision of how I want the world to look. And I'm always going to trudge along in that space. And whenever I've gotten myself into hot water or in trouble or, existential crises in doing this work, it's because I've stepped out of that integrity and I'm trying to optimize for something else. And so, yeah, I want people to be like, you know what? I'm inspired by that legacy of her. Like, she's strange. She was always a strange one. But, that's part of, some of my magic, I hope, too, in terms of I'm not doing this and presenting myself, my work, my contributions on this planet in hopes that somebody's sort of looking over my shoulder to give me the pat on the back. There's something very internal that drives me, and the value to other people, I hope too, is when any of us are doing that, the amplifying effect of operating from our truth is 1,000x. Like that is where we actually really create the world that I think we all want.
I love that, Eva. Thank you for sharing that. And I love what you said about you know how you want the world to look like, and now you're on the journey, on the path to make that, give your contribution to make that a reality. I think that's so powerful. Eva, as we close, where can people go to find out more about you and Littlefoot Ventures?
Yeah, people can find me at littlefootventures.com, where they can get more information about me, my services, my work. They can email me at eva@littlefootventures.com, and I'm on LinkedIn as well. And I encourage people to follow and subscribe to the monthly newsletter that I send, sort of, a monthly recap of my observations in this space. Yeah, and I hope that I can be in service to this listening who I already know is doing so many incredible things, and Littlefoot Ventures is here to help.
Amazing. Eva, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you. I've learned so much. I know the audience has as well, and look forward to future collaboration. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.